Bonjour. Today's video is kindly sponsored by Babbel, the world's #1 best-selling language learning app. Hey, 42 here. You're probably familiar with the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. It's one of those timeless tales that's been told and retold for centuries. Legendary German author Goethe wrote a famous poem about it, as did English poet Robert Browning. And perhaps the best-known version of the story was written by the most renowned purveyors of fairy tales in history, the Brothers Grimm. You may not know it, but Hamelin is actually a real place, a small town in Lower Saxony, Germany. As you can probably imagine, the town likes to play up its fairy tale link, and it attracts tens of thousands of tourists each year off the back of it. But this is where things get a little strange. Hamelin is an old town, first settled way back in the 8th century. If you were to take a trip there today and delve into the town's extensive archives, you might stumble across an entry written over 600 years ago in 1384. It's only short, just 9 words long, but those 9 words speak volumes. It is over 100 years since our children left. You see, the Pied Piper of Hamelin isn't like most fairy tales, carefully constructed to teach children about the real world. In fact, it isn't really a fairy tale at all. It's based on real events, disturbing ones. With over 10 million subscribers worldwide and content updated daily, Babbel is top of the list for anyone who's looking to learn a new language, and it's easy to see why. I have a few distant relatives in France who I'd like to know a little bit better, but they don't speak much English, and it would be really nice if I could converse a little easier with them. So, my New Year's resolution this year is to learn to speak French with Babbel. Babbel is packed full of great learning content, and it's all designed by real-life language experts in order to get you learning with real-life situations and dialogue. It offers 10-minute lessons that are proven to get you speaking in a new language in just 3 weeks. Babbel also has podcasts, stories, and games to completely immerse yourself in the language of your choice. Babbel is great because it works. But don't just take my word for it. University studies have actually shown that just 15 hours of Babbel are equivalent to a full semester of college Spanish. So, this year, why don't you make a New Year's resolution you can actually stick to and feel good about yourself at the same time by learning a new language with Babbel. If you sign up to Babbel today, you can get 65% off, and Babbel offers a 20-day money-back guarantee. So you've got nothing to lose. Click the link in the description to start learning a new language today. Au revoir et bonne chance. Just in case you aren't familiar with the original fairy tale, it goes something like this. Hamelin's suffering from a rat problem when a chap in colourful clothes, the Pied Piper, turns up claiming to be the world's best-dressed rat catcher. Keen to be rid of the town's whiskery scourge, the mayor of Hamelin agrees to pay a large sum of money to this stranger for his services. Unfortunately, the Pied Piper isn't much of a businessman, because instead of writing up a contract or asking for a down payment, he just gets to work. That work is fairly unorthodox too. He doesn't reach for the warfarin or set up some traps. No, the Pied Piper pulls out his flute and begins to play. No doubt that raises a few eyebrows amongst the people of Hamelin, but to their amazement, thousands of rats suddenly begin to emerge from their hiding places. The Piper then leads them down to the river, where they promptly drown themselves. But this is where the Pied Piper's lack of paperwork comes back to bite him on his colourful arse, because Hamelin's mayor refuses to pay up. To exact his revenge, the Piper begins playing once more, only this time, it's the children who follow him out of the town. Exactly what happens next depends on which version of the story you read, but most involve the children reaching some kind of sticky end or disappearing, never to be seen again. The evidence that these events, or at least something like them, really did take place in Hamelin more than 700 years ago is compelling. Along with that eerie entry in the town's ledger I just mentioned, eyewitness accounts appear in several surviving texts from the 14th and 15th centuries. The events were also depicted in a stained glass window that was installed in the town church somewhere around 1300, presumably as a grim reminder of the tragic event that had taken place a few years earlier. Then there's the inscription that can be found carved into the facade of one of Hamlin's oldest buildings, fittingly known as the Pied Piper's house. Carved about 500 years ago, it reads, AD 1284, on the 26th of June, the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children, born in Hamlin, were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicolored clothes. After passing the cavalry near the Koppenberg, they disappeared forever. There's enough here to convince most historians that some kind of tragedy befell the children of Hamlin all those years ago. But what exactly that tragedy was is the subject of some debate, and for obvious reasons. I mean, it's safe to say we can't take the story of the Pied Piper entirely at face value. For one thing, rats aren't known to be susceptible to flute-based mind control. Neither are children, for that matter. Most people who've studied the origins of the story believe it grew out of a real event that's slowly been embellished over the centuries through a kind of multi-generational game of Chinese whispers. Meaning, something terrible really did happen to the children of Hamlin in 1284. And the story of the Pied Piper that we know today has survived as a kind of folk memory of that tragedy. As for what really happened, well, there are several interesting theories. The first is that Hamlin's children were killed in a massive accident of some kind. A few different options have been suggested. Some people believe the children were drowned in a nearby river after the collapse of a bridge. Others suspect a landslide might have been to blame. If the accident theory is true, the Pied Piper himself probably never existed, and was instead added to the story later to represent the figure of death, leading the children out of this world and into the next. The accident hypothesis is certainly plausible, but it does seem a little unlikely that so many children, 130 according to the plaque, could have been killed in a single event like that. And if they were, no records survive that mention the incident explicitly. One theory that's been fairly popular over the years is that the Black Death was to blame for the loss of the Hamlin's children, who were led away from the town in order to stop the terrible disease from spreading. You can see why people have favoured this one, since rats are central to both the story of the Pied Piper and the history of the Black Death. Although, if you haven't seen my video on why rats probably weren't to blame for the Black Death, I recommend you give it a try. Whilst it looks pretty good on paper, this theory is easy to rule out. First of all, rats didn't appear in the story of the Pied Piper of Hamlin at all until the mid-1500s. They're just one of the many embellishments added to the tale over the centuries. And second, the dates don't work. The loss of Hamlin's children in 1284 predates the arrival of the bubonic plague in Europe by more than 60 years. Proponents of the Black Death theory have suggested Hamlin might have been the site of an early plague outbreak, but that's just a case of trying to make the facts fit the theory rather than basing the theory on the facts. Not only is it pretty unlikely that 130 cases of bubonic plague would have randomly popped up in a small town in Germany and then gone away for 60 years, it's even more unlikely that only children would have been affected. One of the more enticing theories about the disappearance of the children of Hamlin might already be familiar to you if you've been following the channel for a while. Some people have postulated that the children were struck down by an outbreak of dancing mania, a kind of mass psychogenic illness that's poorly understood, even to this day. During dancing manias, hundreds or even thousands of people would suddenly start to dance uncontrollably, sometimes doing so for days on end until they dropped dead from exhaustion. I did a whole video on this incredibly weird phenomenon a while back, so I won't go into too much detail here on the specifics, but both the location and the timelines do seem to fit, at least approximately. Most of Europe's dancing manias occurred between the 14th and 17th centuries in England, Germany, and the Netherlands. And there are a few examples where only children were involved, including one that took place just a couple of 100 miles from Hamelin. Whether or not that's just a coincidence is impossible to say. A dancing mania might explain where the Pied Piper comes into things as well. A piper could conceivably have triggered a dancing mania outbreak, or perhaps the figure was added to the story in retrospect, in an attempt to try and rationalise the fact that 130 children just got up and started dancing for no reason. Whilst there's something quite compelling about this theory, it does come with its downsides. Dancing manias didn't tend to kill all of those that took part. In fact, some historians dispute the idea that they were ever actually fatal at all. So presumably, if an outbreak of uncontrollable dancing was the kernel of truth at the centre of the Pied Piper story, plenty of children involved would have lived to tell the tale. If that were the case, it doesn't really fit with either the town ledger entry or the inscription on the Pied Piper's house, both of which imply the missing children were gone for good. English writer William Manchester had his own colourful theory about the origins of the story, suggesting that the Pied Piper was a psychopathic child molester who preyed on the children of Hamelin for his own sexual gratification. Which sounds pretty extreme, but it's certainly more plausible than one of the other common explanations: aliens. Some historians, okay, probably not historians, believe the Pied Piper was actually a being from another world who charmed the children of Hamelin using a high-tech alien device that the locals thought looked a bit like a flute. I'm going to go ahead and put this one down as a long shot. Actually, it's fair to say that all the theories I've covered so far are pretty speculative. There isn't really enough evidence to confidently confirm or rule out most of them. But the next one, which incidentally is favoured by the majority of historians these days, is slightly different. And whilst it's a little less dramatic than pandemics or pedos, it's still pretty intriguing in its own way. The world was a very different place back when the children of Hamelin went missing. If you fly over Western Europe in an aeroplane today, the vast majority of what you can see is either some kind of settlement or farmland. The world as we humans have made it. But 700 years ago, the global population was just 5% of what it is today, and the spaces in between inhabited areas were much bigger. It was forests, not farms, that dominated the landscape. That meant anybody wishing to go and claim new territory first needed to clear it off of trees and undergrowth. No small task, considering the cutting-edge technology in, well, cutting edges consisted of hand axes and saws at the time. Clearing large swathes of dense forest with this limited arsenal was hard work, and it took a lot of dedicated manpower. According to Professor Jürgen Neudolf, a former linguistics professor at the University of Göttingen, that's the same university where the Brothers Grimm once taught, by the way, the children of Hamelin were simply hired en masse by landowners from the east to clear forests and build new towns, villages, and estates. You might be wondering why anyone would hire kids for this kind of hard labour, and that's a fair question. It might just be that the word children is being used pretty liberally here. We all know older people who still consider us to be children, no matter how often we tell them that we're proper newspaper-reading, tax-paying grown-ups these days. Plus, most landowners tended to specifically target younger people, since they were typically healthier and less bothered about upping sticks and moving somewhere new. Or maybe the use of the word children was simply meant to refer to the citizens of Hamelin in general. Either way, this theory makes a lot of sense, particularly in a historical context. A large swathe of land south of the Baltic Sea in what is now Poland became available for German colonization in the 13th century, after the Danish, who had recently invaded, were defeated in the Battle of Bornhoved in 1227. As a result, there was plenty of eastward immigration going on at the time, as wealthy landowners looked to claim the new territory. To aid in their expansion efforts, many employed what were known as locators, men who would go from town to town, attempting to recruit able-bodied individuals to help them with all the grunt work, Interestingly enough, locators often wore brightly coloured coats and funny hats that weren't a million miles away from the garments the Pied Piper is usually depicted as wearing. One such locator may well have ended up in Hamelin, and after selling the dream of a new life and riches to the east, left with a large number of the town's younger denizens. To add a little more weight to this theory, several towns and villages with various versions of the name Hamelin appeared to the east around this time, hinting that widespread emigration very likely did take place. German names that were once common in Hamelin also crop up with surprising frequency in some parts of Poland, even to this day. Having said all that, there's still no way to know for sure if some kind of mass emigration was the tragic event that morphed into the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. It seems to fit in many ways, but then the evidence is still very much circumstantial. Hamelin is just one of hundreds of towns that would have been affected by eastward emigration at the time. So it's difficult to see why this particular example would have spread across the globe in the form of a folk memory in quite the way it has. So, was the Pied Piper a fictional embodiment of death in the face of some centuries-old tragedy? A particularly skillful headhunter in a fancy coat? Or one of history's scariest child molesters? I'll leave that up to you. Thanks for watching.